Venezuela had a major problem. They had a massive oil field in its interior, but the oil had a thick, tar-like consistency that just wasn't economically viable. But then the price of crude suddenly went up and they started exporting this oil primarily to the United States.
When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door. But now we're buying oil from Venezuela, so we're making a dictator very rich.
The United States happened to have built much of its refining infrastructure around processing this type of heavy oil. These refineries are extremely expensive to build, but the problem was that domestically produced oil had become much lighter. Their solution was to import heavy oil, which today makes up over 2/3 of all oil imports. Without this, many of the largest US refineries would become much less competitive.
No me ha colocado como presidente el gobierno de los Estados Unidos.
But it wasn't a match made in heaven.
Que no estoy subordinado a ningún gobierno extranjero imperialista.
Venezuela is one of the few countries that have this type of oil in abundance. But they messed up. They initially saw their economic output increase more than fivefold, but then they so badly mismanaged their oil money that the entire system collapsed like a house of cards. This is how Venezuela screwed up with hindsight. So in this video, we're going to of course work towards that escalation with the United States, and we're going to place that into broader strategic perspective. A big part of this story is oil, but there are other pieces of the puzzle that you must understand. It's crucial to understand the strategic interests from countries like Iran, China, and Russia. And we must look at the facts on the ground. There are nearly 30 million people who live in Venezuela, and another 9 million people have left the country. So we'll get to that perspective of the United States, but first we must understand some internal developments, and really quickly. I recently enabled memberships on this channel. If you want to support my work, consider joining as a member with a small monthly donation. This would help me cover some of the costs of doing the research and the production of these videos. Click on the link in the description or pinned comment, which brings you to this page with all the details. I really appreciate your attention, and now let's get back to Venezuela. In the 1920s, Venezuela had a small population and an economy built on agriculture. But that changed almost overnight. Researchers were searching for oil near this tidal lake, Lake Maracaibo, and one night they struck big. The Barroso 2 well blew out and discovered a massive oil field beneath. This was Venezuela's spectacular entry into the global oil age. Oil didn't just become an industry, it became the foundation of the state. Production took off almost immediately, but in the 1940s, 50s and 60s, there was an almost 1,000% increase. This led government budgets to soar, cities to expand, and Venezuela suddenly had more money than they knew how to spend. Let's fast forward to the 1970s, when the world changed.
It is an all-out war. The surprise attacks came early this morning by Syria and Egypt.
First, during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, Arab oil exporters imposed an oil embargo, and later, during the Iranian Revolution, which removed millions of barrels of oil per day from global markets. As a result of these political shocks, oil prices surged and became unstable. Venezuela now had to make a decision. They could increase their exports and make a lot of money quickly, or they could follow the Arab strategy. And they chose the latter. They lowered their production so that they could produce less while earning more per barrel. Venezuela's oil fields were maturing, and they had to think about the future. After the 1970s, oil prices continued to fluctuate, but they got lucky. They discovered a vast reserve of oil in Venezuela's mainland, but it was a very thick oil that was not yet commercially viable. This could have been a wake-up call for Venezuela. They had built their entire economy on oil, and these price fluctuations directly affected the government's budget. An over-reliance on oil makes other exports less competitive, and Venezuela was increasing their dependence on this one single resource. So how they managed their country is that whenever oil prices went down, they would just wait for them to go up again. And if this took too long, they would just print more money. And I'll get to that later.
El siglo que viene para nosotros es el siglo de la esperanza.
Introducing Hugo Chavez.
El problema es económico.
He came to power on the promise to lift millions of Venezuelans out of poverty, and he did expand education, healthcare, and food programs. But not by building a diversified economy. Instead, He poured the country's booming oil incomes into massive social spending, and he got lucky from the start. He came to power in 1999, and right thereafter, global oil prices rose to a record of nearly $100 per barrel. So, what did he do? Oil production, when he came to power, was already at a peak high, and he continued riding that wave. Billions of oil dollars went into social missions, subsidies, and public employment, and millions of Venezuelans saw their lives actually improve.
Arreglémoslo nosotros mismos, colombianos, venezolanos, ecuatorianos, sentados en paz y como hermanos que lo somos.
Chávez became immensely popular.
La razón de mayor peso de que Estados Unidos quiera poner aquí un gobierno subordinado a él, al imperio, como lo tuvieron durante mucho tiempo, es el petróleo venezolano.
The United States has a dark past in Latin America and meddled with many countries' governments. They were the imperialists, they were the aggressor, and supporters of Chávez saw him as the man who was finally standing up against this big imperial power from the north.
Quiere imponernos su modelo de explotación y de saqueo y su hegemonía a punta de guerras.
But the entire system worked because the price of oil was high. This specced the government's coffers, and this was invested in programs that had very quick results. But it only worsened the underlying problem, and that's when Maduro came to power.
Chosen by Hugo Chavez as his successor, Nicolas Maduro has followed his mentor into power.
Nicolas Maduro was a close ally of Chavez. He served as his foreign minister and vice president, and in the early days, he was a bus driver. He was a man of the people who would continue the path of Chavez, but that's when oil prices fell hard. The price of a barrel of crude fell from $92 to $49 in a single year. And that's when we saw the mess that Venezuela had built.
The world hasn't seen such a drop in crude oil prices for a long time.
The tumbling oil prices had a catastrophic effect in Venezuela.
Maduro could have done the right thing in that moment. He had just come to power, and he could have admitted that his government had made mistakes, that the system was all corrupt, and that they now must make the painful decision to stop spending money and to diversify the economy. But he did none of these things. I mentioned printing money earlier, and that was classic Venezuelan economic policy. Whenever the price of oil went down and they needed cash, they would just print some more.
Now, inflation in Venezuela is expected to reach 1,000,000%.
And it looks like the economic crisis there is about to get even worse.
Inflation became so extreme that money became worthless. While Chavez oversaw the extremely fast growth of the Venezuelan economy, Maduro oversaw how the entire system collapsed like a house of cards. There were shortages of food and medicine, supermarket shelves were empty, and corruption soared. But the strength of a democracy is that when those in power are majorly screwing up, they can be removed through elections.
In Venezuela's elections, the opposition is celebrating a landslide victory over the ruling Socialist Party.
After winning 99 of the 167 seats in parliamentary elections.
In 2015, the opposition won the parliamentary elections in a landslide, getting a 2/3 supermajority. But Maduro wasn't letting go. He just created a parallel new assembly, after which tens of thousands of people took to the streets to protest. Maduro repressed the unrest violently.
Anti-government protests continue in Venezuela.
Hundreds of people have been injured and more than 2,000 arrested.
In 2018, there were presidential elections, which were widely regarded as rigged. Maduro officially won, but it led to more mass protests in the streets, and Venezuela's outlook was getting worse and worse. The country was so brutally mismanaged, there were such harrowing shortages, and the country was so corrupt and so unsafe that millions of Venezuelans felt forced to leave the country. In 2018, in a single year, nearly 1.4 million people left. This was by far the largest refugee outflow ever recorded in Latin America, and that's when something changed.
The government accepted its defeat against the dollar and has allowed it to emerge from the grassroots level.
Prices are all in US dollars.
The national currency had become completely worthless, so people shifted to dollars. Most families could only survive through remittances or from money from abroad, and a black market was emerging that was now based on the US dollar. This helped the crisis to stabilize, but at an extremely low point. Venezuela is in deep trouble. They have by far the lowest minimum wage in Latin America at just $3 per month, which is cruel because they still have the largest proven oil reserves of any country in the entire world. They have more oil than Russia and the United States combined. But their oil rigs are poorly maintained, and they struggle finding the right engineers. But they're still making big money off this resource, and it might be a rhetorical question, but where do you think these revenues are going? Well, Venezuela is also the third most corrupt country in the world after South Sudan and Somalia. Maduro and the people closest to him are enriching themselves. Senior military officers and political insiders are accused to facilitate the illegal drug trade through their territory. The large flow of migrants, the flow of illicit drugs, directly links the crisis in Venezuela to the United States. So let's get to the elephant in the room.
We're making a dictator very rich. Can you believe this? Nobody can believe it.
The United States has a complicated relationship with Venezuela.
Their oil is garbage. It's horrible. The worst you can get. Tar. It's like tar.
So one of the narratives that I see a lot in the media, and that is just plain false, is that it was the United States that was responsible for this mess in Venezuela. After the 2015 elections, the US imposed sanctions, but this was still mostly symbolic. But after the rigged presidential elections, which led to violent crackdowns and massive refugee flows, US sanctions became much more severe. Half of Venezuela's exports are shipped to the United States, making it by far their biggest trade partner. The thick, tar-like oil that Venezuela produces is mostly refined in the United States, which, due to sanctions, was now off-limits. And Maduro needed these oil incomes to manage the growing unrest at home. The human toll was deepening. Blackouts were common. Unofficial estimates put the number of daily blackouts at 200. Hospitals only functioned because of volunteers, and, ironically, there were massive shortages of fuel. To manage the country under the extra pressure from sanctions, Maduro started searching for other allies.
Russian President Vladimir Putin, in a phone call with Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, expressed solidarity with the Venezuelan people.
Beijing has been vocal in supporting the government of President Maduro.
Iran provided technical know-how for extracting and refining oil. China became Venezuela's key financial partner and provided funding. And Russia provided the Venezuelan army with weapons and intelligence. These events led the US to look at Venezuela through a broader geopolitical lens. For whoever didn't pay attention in school, you must understand the Monroe Doctrine. In short, it warned European powers that any attempt to expand their political system in the Americas would be considered a hostile act against the United States. And this doctrine was further extended to justify military action in Latin America during the Cold War. And right now, what we're seeing in Venezuela is that this logic is resurfacing. Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua are the three remaining left-wing authoritarian governments in Latin America who are still friendly with US adversaries. This challenges US influence in the region, and in 2025, tensions flared up.
Cameras spotted 2 US warships a few miles off the coast of Venezuela.
The Caribbean suddenly became one of the most militarized stretches of water in the Western Hemisphere. The United States began moving warships, surveillance aircrafts, and Coast Guard vessels. Within weeks, a third of the entire US Navy was stationed here. In Puerto Rico and Curacao, they deployed extra troops. This looked less like a routine deployment and more like a preparation for a standoff.
The surging U.S. forces are stationed here on land and on ships in the Caribbean, with their sights set on Venezuela.
Washington framed this buildup as a response to 2 main threats. The first is drug trafficking networks, which U.S. officials claimed were using Venezuelan waters more aggressively than ever before. The second was the surge of Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang that the U.S. had designated an enemy organization earlier that year. This framing was crucial. It allowed Washington to maintain the stance that the US was not escalating towards an interstate conflict. But then they struck.
President Trump announced late today that the United States has sunk a boat after it left Venezuela carrying drugs.
On September 2nd, the first boat was hit.
Every boat that we knock out, we save 25,000 American lives.
Everybody on board was killed. The US said that this happened in international waters, which Venezuela disputes. US boats were now increasingly patrolling just outside Venezuela's exclusive economic zone, And that's when it further escalated.
The Pentagon announcing another U.S. strike on an alleged drug trafficking boat decimated off the coast of Venezuela.
There was another strike off the coast of Venezuela and another further out at sea. The following months, there were almost 24 of such incidents, and they were now also targeting boats in the Eastern Pacific. There were 22 incidents in total, which claimed 82 lives.
We knocked out 96% of the drugs coming in by water.
It has escalated into a political confrontation, but to what end? So there are two sides of this story. On one hand, Venezuela is saying that the United States is manufacturing a crisis to justify an intervention, which could be true. While on the other hand, the Trump administration says that it's fighting criminal organizations that Maduro tolerated, which technically is also true. But it looks a lot like what Russia did before launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The difference, you may say, are the reasons